Hey, it's Conor Svensson here, founder and CEO at Web3 Labs. This is a conversation I had with Joshua Tan, the executive director of the Metagovernance project. In addition to the Metagovernance or Metagov project as it's known, Josh is a PhD researcher focusing on the applications of collective intelligence in the governance of online communities, including DAOs. Josh has been involved in DAOs for the past 4 years. With his work at Metagov, he's working to build a governance layer for the internet. He's helping drive standards for DAOs and bring together key organisations in the space as well. In our conversation, we covered the ways in which his work is combining AI research with DAOs, some of the cutting edge challenges we need to overcome with DAOs for mainstream adoption, and how widespread they could become. DAOs fascinate me, and it was great to get Josh's perspectives on them, as he's been working at the forefront of this fast moving area of Web3 for some time now. Hey, Josh, it's great to have you here on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, I like to always open just to get a bit of perspective on people's own personal journeys with respect to Web3. And so, I'd love to hear about your own path in terms of how you first learned about it, what got you into it, and what got you to that point where you're working on a number of different projects in the space.
Yeah. So I got into Web3 through a relatively circuitous route. The short story is that Primavera de Filippi kind of nerd sniped me about Web3 and brought me into the whole DAO scene. The slightly longer story is that I was in Berlin, I think of 2018, and I was working with a video game company, kind of doing a little bit of kind of consulting there. And they put me in a desk next to a law professor whose name was Lawrence Lessig. And Larry is kind of an expert in cyber law and constitutional law and sort of coined the phrase code is law, which is kind of popular in these circles. And long story short, Larry and I ended up teaching a course together. And then immediately after the course, we started this project called Metagov, which does a lot of research and builds a lot of tooling around, let's say, online governance, especially self-governance. And of course, I'm sure people here must know there's a huge governance is hugely important to the Web3 space in general.
And so with respect to Metagov, you've been working on that for a number of years, and there's been kind of initiatives that have spun off that as well. And is that something that's been like a full-time endeavor? I know that you've been doing a PhD as well, and so what's kind of the balance there with that versus your other responsibilities?
Yeah. So I started this PhD really thinking I'd be doing um, relatively theoretical mathematics, kind of relating certain kinds of geometry to certain kind of problems in AI. And then Metagov happened and it essentially took over my life. So I work easily more than a full-time job on Metagov these days. Uh, so what I've kind of like transitioned into and the way that I balance my kind of like existing interest with the work I do at Metagov is I think about it kind of broadly speaking as a kind of like a how do I say it? Research on a collective intelligence, right? AI is intelligent in one particular kind of way, but organizations and DAOs are also intelligent in a different kind of way. And part of what I do is apply different kinds of mathematical tools and different, let's say, paradigms for sort of reasoning about these kinds of systems together so that we can analyze both sets of phenomenon and maybe have one learn from the other.
Okay. So, I guess as DAOs certainly increase in terms of the number that are out there, they in themselves are complex systems, right? And so there's this kind of parallels when you're looking at things through your sort of lens there that you can kind of start to tease out what will be some similarities between them.
Yeah, so it's like one of the things I think a lot about coming from like the more kind of like mathematical background is how to represent these things, right? If you think of traditional organizations, one typical way in which we represent them is through org charts, right? There's the CEO at the top, and that goes down to sort of like different people in the C-suite, and then go to sub teams and blah blah blah, right? This is how like a corporation is structured, and certainly how like a very hierarchical sort of organization like a military is structured. On the other hand, there are like networks, and they're usually represented through graphs. If you think about DAOs, they're kind of like a synthesis between like a traditional hierarchy, a traditional network with elements of like sort of market systems, especially with like tokenomics, right? So it's all these different organizational forms kind of like being stuffed into one place that forms what we sort of typically imagine or think about as a DAO. And I was just having like a long conversation with some of the other researchers in Metagov about how exactly to represent this. How can we synthesize these, graph and tree and other sorts of structures to represent like the essential, what is essential about a DAO?
And so, with being able to find these these representations to simulate them, what would be some of like the big, I guess, types of problems that you'd want to apply that to for, I guess, modeling where things could go to, say, because it's there's so many different DAOs for so many different things emerging, and I'm sure like many in Web3, you're very the whole concept of DAOs, it is transformative and it has so much potential across, whether it's loosely organized groups of people all the way through to commercial business entities and being represented in that structure. What's kind of the stuff that really interests you around how you could model these and how they
Yeah,
kind of interact, because it's a vast landscape.
yeah, mm, it's complicated. I can give you so many lists of problems, and there's actually let me describe two different projects that maybe would be relevant to this question. Uh, the first thing that jumped to mind is just last week, um, actually a few days ago on Friday, we had a roundtable at DAO Star One. So I don't know if maybe I haven't mentioned DAO Star One before, but it's large standards body slash industry body that is building technical standards for DAOs and DAO tooling. It's like over 70 organizations with pretty much all the names that you can think of, like Aragon, Gnosis, Tribute, Tally, Snapshot, etc. And we had a conversation featuring the CEOs of Snapshot, of Tally, Bry, Paladin, Commonwealth, to talk about the challenges of governance tooling, right? How do you do governance in these systems? Sorry, go ahead.
So sorry to interrupt, but I think it might be really helpful to unpack some of those companies for our listeners as well, because
Oh, sure.
just so that there's a reference point there, because folks like Snapshot, for instance, they're one of the leading DAO governance platforms where people vote and so on. And of
Hmm.
course, you
Hmm.
mentioned Gnosis, who do a lot of the tooling. Maybe just if you give a brief overview of some of those players, because I think a lot
Sure,
of
sure.
people listening will be familiar with DAOs, but they won't be familiar necessarily with this huge ecosystem of
Ah,
different companies that have created all this great tooling and infrastructure for it, which feeds into the sort of standardization efforts that
hmm.
you're
Hmm.
leading there as well.
Yeah, so I would think like Gnosis is well known for producing, or at least in sort of my context, two projects: Gnosis safes, which are the kind of standard multi-sig that people use in this ecosystem, as well as Gnosis Chain, formerly XDAI. The You can also, and I kind of like group Gnosis with folks like Aragon, Moloch, DAO House, One Hive, Tribute, because they're like essentially frameworks for DAOs. You can go to them, you can create a DAO using their frameworks, using their factory contracts. The other companies like Snapshot, you just mentioned, but also Tally, Commonwealth, uh, Snapshot, and Paladin, they're sort of geared much more toward like you have a DAO, now you need to sort of like, how do you run this? Through some sort of like voting, through some sort of delegation. And these are tools that help you essentially make your DAO actually functional, right? Uh, there's kind of like an overlap because many of the frameworks do come with certain kinds of voting features, but these the voting tools just specialize in these things, right? And they're actually quite well adopted. So hopefully that gives a reasonable overview of some of the inputs in here. And anyways, there was a conversation around the challenges of governance tooling. And one of the things that came up that I thought was super interesting was basically it was a question around proposal simulation, is the way I think about it. But like governance participation is a huge problem in DAOs. Governance is hard. It takes time to sort of like do research on all these proposals. It's just like people don't really care, right? The vast majority of people in a DAO are not going to participate, and this is a huge roadblock to building good tools and getting good governance inside that DAO. So how do you approach that? For various reasons, actually, like delegation seems to be like highly problematic because people don't even care enough to like, you know, make the right delegations. Where they'll delegate something at the very beginning where they sort of log into that DAO and they just forget about it. So you have these just hanging sort of delegations that like aren't doing anything. You know, the wallet addresses might be like abandoned in like they're just there. The
And would this be off the back of to give like a classic example, say when a project does a big airdrop to its users to get a DAO off the ground, like say Uniswap did, like Ethereum Name Service did, some of these really successful ones.
mhm,
People claim these tokens, and then not that many people actually participate in the governance of it. They might hold the tokens, hoping that they're going to appreciate, but then that's kind of it in terms of their involvement in them.
exactly. Um, so honestly, to some degree, the participation rates like look more awful than they actually are, because like you airdrop all these tokens based on this sort of hypothesis, like you're trying to get some of them to participate. Obviously, not all of them will, but that's okay, right? The actual contributor base, the folks who are actually, let's say, like interacting with the DAO on some other way, often will also participate in certain forms of governance. The uh, One of the other sort of problems, and this goes back more relates more specifically to like sort of like thinking about representations of DAOs, is around proposals. So basically, one of the issues with using or participating in DAOs is like you see these proposals, don't really have a sense of like what are they really going to do, because some of them are highly technical, some of them are funding things that like you're not like an expert in, nor do you have the time to sort of do it. Or even if you do want to sort of like think about and do the research there, it takes time and effort. It's hard. So one of the sort of questions is like, for any given proposal, can we give people a kind of simulation? Like this is what the actual effect of this is going to be, whether on the tokenomics, whether on the governance, whether on, other potential outcomes like participation, decentralization, etc. Uh, to do that, we need like a better representation of proposals um, across different DAOs, and more essentially metadata. Like, how are we actually going to represent these so that we can start doing some of these computations, adding some of these decision support services to make what is currently, okay process as easy as possible, so that we can actually, get people engaged and actually participating in a how do I say, in a productive way. So yeah, at least two major challenges in delegation and in, let's say, proposal simulation. And this is not from me. This is like from the words of the people who are like building these companies and trying to like interacting deeply with DAOs on a daily basis. I would also there's a separate sort of project that, since you mentioned problems, that I'll just briefly mention. As part of the launch of a recent project called the Dao Research Hub, where Metagov is collaborating with two other, let's say, like major research organizations in the space, Dao Research Collective and the Smart Contract Research Forum. So we're teaming up to form this Dao Research Hub, whose main goal is to basically build a research network of academics and universities so that they can tackle more of the sort of like these deep challenges, these deep open problems in DAOs. And we are publishing, hopefully soon it'll be released, maybe not this month, but hopefully within this summer, a large survey paper on open problems in DAO science that's taking some of the well-known, let's say, challenges that DAOs are facing today and essentially converts them into chunkable research projects as well as engineering projects that different, let's say, scientists as well as engineers can, sink their teeth into. So we're saying like, if you're going to spend time in this and commit to this space, here's where we believe you can make the most impact.
Okay, cool. So in terms of there's like these problems that you're coming at from an academic perspective, but also to turn it on its head a little bit, are there what do you see as like the key areas in which DAOs can benefit the academic community in terms of structurally there as well?
Oh boy, this is a, a long conversation. Um, okay, things are going to get a little bit more controversial, so let me just think about what to say here. So this is burgeoning movement called DeSci for decentralized science, and there's various thoughts around, how DAOs might be able, or let's say Web3 in general, might be able to contribute to science and contribute to research of various sorts. Um, I am a little bit more skeptical of these endeavors. To be fair, it's a very, very sort of very early on in discipline. There's just a huge amount of noise right now. There are several people like Darren Drew that I respect greatly in that space. And I think are doing like could be doing are doing really cool stuff. But I also sense there's just like a lot of hype, like in a lot of Web3, to be honest, around like here are the promises of DAOs for science. None of the current applications seem like that convincing to me. There is a sense in which like maybe DAOs, vis-a-vis like the funding that's possible through these entities, could contribute to certain fields of science by making it easier to essentially fund or sustain, let's say, mid-career professionals that don't necessarily want to become private investigators, which basically ropes you into this whole grant writing loop where you're no longer a researcher, you're just like a grant writer and a manager. And people that, you know, yeah, people who don't want to necessarily go into that, but just want to do actual science. And there's lack of funding for these kinds of people in lots of different situations. Because DAOs, especially insofar as they're able to sort of promote public goods funding, could be part of that story, which would be really quite exciting.
And certainly on that point, I think it's something that has gained a fair degree of traction around many of the different Web3 protocols there who have this grant funding based model where you have a foundation who's responsible for giving out these grants, and some of those are for very academic work. I think cases in points include some of the cryptographic stuff that the Ethereum Foundation has helped
Hmm.
get off the ground. I think. Yeah, so it's an interesting area how it kind of I suppose creates these new funding channels for people interested in the kind of academic approaches there, without
Yeah.
potentially some of the same levels of red tape that they may have been used to.
Maybe one thing I'll just quickly announce while we're talking on this podcast for anybody who's listening who is an academic, one of the, or maybe the major program that we're launching as part of this hub, where it's like big collaboration of multiple entities, is we'll be launching a fellowship program, um, very likely to um, at different universities across the world, but very likely beginning at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh and Stanford University in California, where we're going to be placing a combination of PhD, postdoctoral, and even like visiting faculty fellowships at these universities, so we can build, let's say, these different centers for DAO research, in-person centers. And that's really quite exciting because I think part of the reasoning here is to promote, like, give people who are conducting this research, the sense of like, if I'm going to invest my careers in this or the next 10 years of my life, there's support for that. There are opportunities to advance your career, and to work in a kind of like seminar or cohort based setting where you're, really like in conversation with others doing similar research.
Hearing that there's all those different opportunities for research as well, I think just kind of demonstrates just quite how much interest there is in the potential of DAOs. I'd like to go a little bit deeper into the Metagov project though, in terms of it, and then also some of the additional parts as well. So for people who are interested in DAOs who maybe they're coming at it from a more commercial perspective, maybe they're coming at it from a pure academic perspective, but what's kind of the key things that the Metagov project will give them? Because clearly you're very well connected with key members of the community here, but I think it's helpful just to paint that sort of picture.
Yeah, of course. So Metagov is it's a nonprofit uh, research collective comprising like many different members, and it's relatively decentralized. And the goal, the long-term version of Metagov, is to build a governance layer for the internet. What I think of as like a system of interoperable tools and platforms that talk to each other and that allow people to govern the kind of assets, including websites themselves, that exist on the internet that people care about. The In terms of the precise activities, so we do a wide range of different things. If you're a developer or you're like a software researcher, we build things like the Metagov Gateway, which is the API gateway that makes it easy to access lots of different existing governance tools. Uh, we build like Discord bots for ethnography. So even if you're like a social science researcher, there's some stuff that might be interesting there for you, especially if you're interested in doing digital ethnography of these like blockchain communities who happen mostly live on Discord. So we have like tooling that makes it easier to do that. We also just build a lot of data sets. So if you're a researcher or a data scientist, and you want to understand like the constitutions of DAOs, like the actual written constitutions, or you want to analyze all the contract parameters of Tribute, Aragon, Gnosis Safes, that is like we've built those data sets and hosted them. They're open source. You can use them and do research on them and write papers. So there's a whole selection of sort of services that are geared certainly toward like these are more geared toward, let's say, academics and researchers. Though I think the API gateway could also be interesting if you're building tooling. On the more industry side, there's like two main projects I think that might be of interest to people. One is DAO One. So DAO One is a kind of fiscally sponsored and hosted by Metagov, and is, as I mentioned before, it's a large industry body where we're building technical standards for DAOs. So if you're building tooling, and this is like often the case when I walk into a crypto conference, we start talking, oh, here's some tooling, and then say like, oh, we actually really love interoperability, and we'd love to sort of figure out how to connect our service to everything else that's going on, because like in order Web3 to function, like contracts have to talk to other contracts, tools have to talk to other tools. The data needs to get standardized. Otherwise, like this entire sort of venture doesn't work, right? So there's often huge interest in working with other members of the community to figure out like here's a set of standards that we can agree on to build a kind of fun application that uses all our services, right? What make them together. So that's something we facilitate. We literally put manpower behind it to help you write that standard, do the research to make it as easy, sort of like, and make sure the final product is as like nice as possible, so that it has like a greater chance of adoption, not just with a small collection of folks who are working together, but the larger community. Yeah, so that's like DAOstar One. Just get involved. Check out daostar.org, and you'll be able to get more information on that. And this is for the folks who are coming in here who are not necessarily like super into DAOs, but maybe you're a founder of a tech company where you're thinking about founding something like that. We also run a project that's, to be clear, just getting off the ground, but there's a lot of excitement around it, called To Community. So this is based on one of the research projects that one of Metagov's principal investigators, faculty directors came up with, called Exit Community. It's this idea, we talk about governance transitions or progressive decentralization all the time. It's just this idea that, if you take a given technology company has a traditional cap table with the founders and the investors, and I want to transition that or exit that in some sort of fashion to a community. This could be through a token and an airdrop, but could be through like things that don't necessarily involve Web3 at all. What we're doing is building a software framework that supports especially companies, as they transition or think about like, okay, I'm like a standard company and I want to sort of transition to some form of community governance. How do I do that? Or I want to perform some sort of community raise. Maybe I just raised my seed round. Now I want, during my Series A, I'm thinking, or somewhere in the future, I'm thinking maybe like a community raise could be quite nice. Because, as Web3 has demonstrated, there's potential for like truly awesome, amounts of capital. But also because maybe like the community could be actually a really strong, operational asset in my work. Maybe because like, my company or my technology requires that kind of community interaction, and getting that engagement could be really nice, or just because you believe that having the community part of your governing sort of system is always going to make your align your users with the company and make your company stronger in the long term.
And so with that, because we have seen a number of high-profile Web3 companies transition to DAO-based structures, and there's a lot of belief in why it is important and also how powerful these are, but we're certainly not at that point yet where it, you know a lot of regular companies are considering it. It's still, I'd argue, a slightly experimental phase. What do you think the key barriers are for broader adoption there? Do you think it's coming from the technology, more regulatory or jurisdictional support for it? Yeah, I'd be interested to get your takes there. And with these shortcomings, well, I say shortcomings, but with these kind of gaps in mind, when will we get to that point where we have this broader
Mm-hmm.
adoption, do you think?
To be quite honest, I think it's all of the above. It's financial, it's lack of legal clarity, it's this perception of Web3 as, like, I mean, for better or worse, I guess for worse, a lot of people have this like sense of like, what is Web3? These crazy people with tokens. Just give me my traditional legal agreement and let me run my company, right? Um, so there's a sense like going with Web3 means taking a risk on top of all the other risks you're taking as a startup, right? Which is not great. And also, I would just say like operational, like does going into sort of like setting up a DAO actually make your company run better from an operational perspective? Does it engage in community help you make actually better decisions? I think there's just so much that's uncertain that needs to be proven and validated and communicated to companies before they'll really bite the bullet. So there are companies that I'll say that the underlying sort of like question here about like engaging in community is like clearly companies like do care about this. You can see like Uber and Airbnb sort of contemplating different ways of giving their super users better like more rights and more sort of more rewards. Uh, I've been talking with folks at GitHub and Kickstarter who are like clearly like aligned companies who are thinking about like, hey, how do I sort of like exit certain parts of this or like adopt certain aspects of this ecosystem and of DAOs that like fit particular products or particular sort of like roles. Uh, Still very much early stage explorations, to be clear. But like I think those conversations are really quite exciting to me because they promise that it's not just going to be like the small slice of the crypto folks making DAOs or crypto companies, but it's like all the other companies. Right? To me, this is recently I just posted like a long bet on this. Like if 10 years from now, imagine a world in which DAOs own or manage more assets than traditional corporations. Just like where DAOs literally occupy more than 50% of the economy. Like, what would actually take us there? And to me, like the most convincing thing is like, okay, eventually we're going to get toward more legal clarity, though obviously like, we need to do more work on building like not only sort of like getting legal clarity, but like actually building in maybe legal advantages in recognition of the fact that, like DAOs are often fulfilling some sort of pro-social purpose. But also just we just need to like really dig deep in like improving the operational efficacy of DAOs. Like we need to be able to convince and validate to companies that starting a DAO now and running your company as this kind of entity is going to make you more competitive in the long run compared to any alternative organization like that's just running like its regular show. Uh, to me, that is what we need to validate. Like we need to validate the power of community and the power of the, let's say, the automation that comes as part of like DAO governance, right? These and like some of the other benefits, like we just need to stick it all together in a package and really, really put that out there.
Completely agree with you, and I especially think the automation side of it is something that's incredibly powerful because with different in whatever jurisdiction people create a company and they have reporting obligations for it, even if it is a private company. And the fact that with the radical transparency that comes with DAOs right now, and there are issues, of course, with that, but in terms of having that enables things like it could be tax reporting as well as just general the the various types of reporting that companies need to do annually, with things like changes in shareholders or whatever else, or directors, for instance. It can happen in real time and be observed in real time in these structures, which is an amazing thing from the perspective of the regulators as well as the tax offices as well, because all of a sudden they're not waiting 12, 24, however many months to actually get this information there, which is I think pretty cool.
Yeah, one of the things I'm most excited about is something that is, I think most people may be considered deeply unsexy, but like accounting standards for DAOs. If it's all transparent, all the spending is like there's like accounting, you should be able to automate a lot of this stuff, or at least make it easier. Really like leaning into that transparency. So yeah, this is one of the things I love to sort of like start getting to work on.
And is that an area that there's much movement on right now? Because it's, I completely agree. It's such a key part of all of this, and the upside for everyone's so good. Apart from tax dodgers, obviously, but everyone else, right? It's really big.
Well, I'm talking with a couple of like let's say like accountants. Tax season is over, and we're going to start hopefully working on the actual like sort of crafting the standard. And a lot of it just that just means like like how should DAOs be publishing this kind of data? Or do we just expect the transaction data to be just it, or should they like sort of be offering some sense of like these are sets of transactions, these are how I want to organize them, and publish that so that like different accounting companies can sort of consume and sort of produce reports for them. Um, this is like still very early stages, so I wouldn't say there's like massive movement in this field right now, but maybe wait 3 months, things move really fast.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess part of it too is having having that right degree of privacy as well, because two areas which certainly strike me as being quite important to get right. One is the one that's often uh, referenced with regards to Constitution DAO, how the fact that it was
Yeah.
where they tried to buy the copy of the US Constitution, and because they're in effect they were revealing their bid before before the auction happened, it meant that the person up against them had that inside information. But also too with things like say staff salaries or who DAOs are paying funds out to, some of that information, especially within in a commercial context, could be sensitive information, because a company doesn't necessarily want to make public who all of its suppliers are in the manufacture of some good. They don't want to show how much every single member of
Yeah.
staff is
Yeah.
getting, but they do want to ensure that, but at the same time, they're comfortable reporting how much they've spent on salaries or how much they've spent on,
Yeah.
say these raw materials for packaging up their product.
Yeah. So actually, this privacy question is what's the right word for this? It is very interesting. Uh, I just find it like, oh my god, there's so complicated. Oh, I can't handle this. Okay, so two things I can say here. One was actually we were recently chatting. What was it? Chatting with Dan Bonet at Stanford, cryptography professor there, and he just released. I don't know if released. It's a HackMD doc, but it's a kind of a new scheme for a privacy-oriented DAO, exactly reacting to this Constitution DAO question. Basically, I basically think of it as like Tornado Cash, but for a DAO where people put in money and then you can withdraw, but it's unclear like where this is all going. So that's like one possible answer to that specific question around like privacy of like the assets in the DAOs in order for for strategic reasons with respect to like auctions, right, or even hiring or whatever. The the on the other side is there is yeah, it gets complicated. So like a lot of what I think about is like how DAOs should be publishing their data. Right? We like design API standards for DAOs, data standards for DAOs, and there are, but things like it's not just DAOs publishing data. Like people want to sort of like say things like I worked for this DAO, or I had these contributions. So like individuals want to sort of like annotate that or declare that they sort of like that they did something. There's obviously the on-chain data, which is always there, and then there's like different services want to publish data around like, oh, actually the same person owns both josh.eth and joshua.eth or something like that, right? So like two wallet addresses are the same, so that you can sort of claim that the contributions that it's a very simple application, right? I want to be able to say I did some work or made some contributions through like one wallet address. I made some others through some different wallet address. But when I'm applying for a job, I want to be declared like actually these are the same people, right? So that's why you should hire me. So lots of different use cases for like, okay, I need to do things that like generally speaking should be private, but also like I need to sort of like in a kind of reserved and a safe way reveal that information to people, right? And then like verify that reveal. So we're building. Uh, Actually, we're releasing maybe like in the next week, or 2 weeks actually, at DAO NYC, uh, an upgraded version of our sort of attestations framework, which is all about like, okay, there's like declarations from all sorts of different people, um, from DAOs, from members, from these issuer third-party entities. Uh, they're all using different identity systems. They all have different sort of approaches to personally identifiable information. Um, just like stuff just needs to work because there are these basic use cases that everybody kind of expects. Uh, how do they communicate, and what are the privacy implications? How do we sort of like, in the smallest way, like try to sort of like have some guardrails or safeguards for privacy sort of information, or keeping private information private. Uh, that will be released in a couple of weeks at DAO NYC.
And in terms of those sorts of attestations you mentioned there, is there much crossover with the initiatives coming out of decentralized identity, such as verifiable credentials around it, or is it kind of a separate approach?
It is basically what I think of as like, it assumes less than verifiable credentials. And actually, like, what was it, Brian, like the folks and Balazs, like folks at the DID Foundation are part of this conversation. We're instrumental in like sort of crafting parts of the standard. The basically like verifiable credentials have not really been adopted yet. Um, so for DAOs, we just want something that works. Like people need to communicate in order to like build these use cases. So the attestation kind of framework kind of assumes like if you want to use a verifiable credential so that you can like like prove these things, prove these claims, then you can, but you don't necessarily have to. They're just claims, arbitrary claims that just like out there in the wild, and people are just passing them back and forth. And how do we allow tools to sort of like grok or like engage with each other's claims or use each other's claims in a kind of like sensible way, right? Uh, I would say also like the API standards that we're designing for DAOs are also like they don't assume DID, but they're compatible with DID. So if you for some reason like maybe you're like a multi-chain DAO, or maybe you just like for whatever reason some of your members you're not going to associate with Ethereum addresses, right? Totally reasonable, and you want to use a DID for them. That's totally fine. Um, it's up to you. You decide how to do that. You can use the service provider to do that for you. But the point is, you can publish the data in a common standardized format so that your membership list will be, some of them will be Ethereum addresses, some of them will be DIDs, some of them will be Cosmos addresses, so on and so forth.
And so something there that you touched on too is the DAO's not on Ethereum, because so far anyway, the vast majority of the activity has been happening there. But it's there's absolutely no reason, as you say, why they shouldn't be on multiple different platforms. But do you think that we're close on seeing a number of different sort of, I guess, DAOs as first-class citizens appear on some of these other platforms now, or is it still quite a sort of Ethereum-centric, much of the ecosystem? Because a lot of the tooling, of course, is focused there.
I think DAOs to survive and to grow, they need to be not just an Ethereum sort of entity. I think a lot of people, even in Ethereum, hardcore Ethereum maxis would maybe even agree with that. The there is like I was having a kind of interesting conversation with Sam Hart at Interchain a couple months ago, and he's pointing out that actually different Cosmos chains are kind of like often effectively DAOs themselves, right? They're maybe technically layer ones, whatever, but the a lot of what we kind of like the practices we associate with DAOs, having these tokens and having engaged governance and like having proposal execution, looks a lot like DAOs, and they have a set of common infrastructure, right? So if you think about it, then sure, like there's actually lots of DAOs in Cosmos. I think Near is putting a lot of effort into sort of building their DAO frameworks, which is exciting, and we've done some work with them before on this. There is I've talked to like folks at Tezos, at even like Cardano, where they're like, just getting started with their DAO frameworks, but there's a lot of excitement in those communities to make DAOs one of the core features, right? And often they have like much lower gas fees, so they just it's like a little bit easier to run certain kind of operations. You don't have to think about all the complexities with on-chain, off-chain communication that happens in the context of Ethereum, right? So different kind of settings. I think DAOs fundamentally, though, like, what's the right way of thinking about this? DAOs are organizations. They are groups of people. Yes, they are also contracts, but they are also groups of people. And people are fundamentally multi-platform. Just think about it that way. Like, if you want something that actually sort of respect the fact like these things are actual organizations with real people and not just like sort of like imaginary programs running in the ether, then you need something that's like going to be like natively multi-platform.
And so to conceptualize that, do you envisage that we'll have a future where people can create a DAO and then, as to quote your example, actually, you can have someone who joins, say, from I don't know, Polkadot. They can join from Solana, wherever else, and in addition to, of course, the Ethereum and its layer twos. There, you could have this kind of this convergence of people where it doesn't really matter what platform they use as their onboarding point, but they're still all kind of equally participatory from the perspective of the DAO.
I absolutely believe that will be the case one day. Hopefully even sooner rather than later. I mean, like if you're a DAO and you're building some sort of product, right? Or you're building some sort of service. And maybe your users some of them are on Ethereum, some of them are on Solana. Like, why wouldn't you exist on multiple sort of places at once, right? And like they already do to some degree, like certainly layer twos. There's one thing I want to add to that. I'm just like forgetting what was I saying? There's one thing that I would say is that like DAOs are organizations and they need to publish information and communicate to their members, right? And even in Ethereum, you see like so much, like with maybe even the vast majority of what counts as governance interaction that's from an organizational perspective is really off-chain. That's like Snapshot, Discord, it's Telegrams, like even Gnosis safes, right? You think they're like completely on-chain, but actually like all the signatures are really hosted off-chain, and then they get passed as a sort of like single thing at the end when you sign it, right? So there's like huge amount of like off-chain components to all these existing sort of like platforms, even on Ethereum, without talking about multi-chain. Given that, I think like we just need to think about like sort of the technical infrastructure of these DAOs in a more like realistic way that sort of actually reflects practice. And practice means that there's just like a bunch of technical infrastructure. Some of that is going to be the on-chain component, which is like the contracts themselves. A lot of it is going to be like living outside of it, where the center of gravity is already like a lot of it is just off-chain hosted on some sort of technical infrastructure. And obviously like the smart contract plays a key role in that, but just like realistically, this is where DAOs are today. So given that, you can just imagine like there's like, different spokes in the wheel. There's different contracts attached to different, this like sort of composite sort of complicated entity, which is the actual DAO, which has this kind of like, complicated and sort of spread out cybernetic presence, right? Mapping into different contracts and different chains.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I think not wanting to feel that it's too far off this sort of stuff, but I mean, when you sort of think in terms of timescales, when if you were to pick sort of a date, I know we've talked about stuff a few years down the line, 10 years into the future, and so on. But if you were to say that by this date, I'd hope to see that DAOs are a more kind of core part of the fabric underpinning many companies. How far off do you think we'd be?
Oh my gosh. I was always taught by my supervisors not to give dates to media. It's invariably going to end badly for me. But I'll say April 28th, 2032 is when I'm hoping DAOs conquer the economy, right? That happens. Whether or not that happens, we'll make a bet and we'll see what happens. The In terms of getting significant traction with, let's say, what's the right word for like mainstream entities or like non-crypto companies, uh, I would say that's, to be quite honest, probably around like we'll probably have our like first big use cases that are actually convincing, maybe like a year or two. I'd say. I think the tooling is kind of already there, or it's kind of like okay, here's the MVP. The but the actual use cases that you would need to validate some of these tools and validate this ecosystem as a whole, I think we just need a time. We still need time to like actually execute those things. It's not enough, I think, just to point at things like like Uniswap or Compound and say like this is how you as a mainstream company that it's like quite hierarchical and has all these traditional legacy structures. Like you can't just point at these existing, for example, and say like this is how it's going to work, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But no doubt with your role at Metagov, though, you have some, but that can be a good way of measuring the pulse as well of some of these more established corporates, because they're likely to want to speak to or come into the fold there to understand more about your work and connect with some of the, I guess, the Web3 pioneers who are really at the forefront of all of this.
Absolutely. To me, like feel part of what like Metagov is a nonprofit research group whose main goal is to uh, understand and support digital self-governance, right? It's like I think of this like we're trying to expand the franchise of like people actually having rights in these systems and being able to sort of like govern the sort of technologies that they actually use. Uh, and to me, like getting these big corporations or just like regular companies into this field and like establishing that kind of practice is like so important. And yeah, that's what we're here for, trying to sort of get something moving.
Absolutely. And so just to kind of tie things up in terms of if people want to get involved with Metagov, I know that you provided some links earlier on in the conversation, but I think just to really sort of drill the message home to our listeners, what's the best way for them to get involved? Head to the website, or are there things that you're really keen for people to do to engage with the project?
Yeah. So easiest way, just go to metagov.org. Um, Meta as in META gov.org. You'll find like we have just go to the very bottom. You'll find we have like a Substack newsletter that comes out monthly. There is a sign up to join the community. And there's also opportunities to actually conduct like a not in person, a live kind of membership conversation. So you can like get a better sense of like, hey, how do I plug into this community? And we highly encourage like if you're like interested in research on governance and DAOs, come in and join the community. I would say that if you're interested more from like an industry perspective, like if you're a validator or you're a DAO tooling developer, uh, get in touch at daostar.org. And you'll click through some of the links, you'll find a mechanism for joining the conversations or joining a working group. And we would love to have you as part of those conversations. Oh, and we're always hiring. We have so many hiring needs.
And if people want to connect with you, which social channels are you active on? Twitter, LinkedIn, or something else?
Yeah, just find me on Twitter. I'm at Joshua Z Tan or Metagov _project.
Well, Josh, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I think it's phenomenal the work that Metagov's up to because given bringing together all these different players in the DAOs and helping to create those standards for the wider community and organisations to build off is such an important thing. So it's been really cool to learn more about it in our conversation.
Connor, thanks so much for having me.
Hi, it's Conor Svensson here again. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I'm really excited to share with you that I've written a book, The Blockchain Innovators Handbook, a leader's guide to understanding, adopting, and succeeding with this disruptive technology. I've been wanting to share my learnings about blockchain and Web3 for a number of years with a wider audience, and I'm really excited that I can do this now. This book covers everything from the fundamentals of the technology through to opportunity identification and implementation for your business to ensure that you can be one of the big beneficiaries of the wider transition to Web3 that's taking place now. The book is available in physical as well as digital form. For more information, head to web3labs.com/innovators.